Hello everybody, I hope you are doing great. Welcome to your online English lessons. Today's video is about defining and non-defining relative clause, your grammar lesson. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to recognize and use relative clauses. You will also be able to make the difference between defining and non-defining clauses. Let's get started. Relative clauses are usually introduced by relative pronouns and adverbs. Who, which, whose, when, where, and that. Of course, we are going to have now a reminder of relative pronouns and adverbs that we have already seen and studied together. The first relative pronoun, who. The relative pronoun who refers to people. For example, the woman who lives here is a novelist. Novelist means she writes novels, stories. She's a writer. It is also possible to use that when we talk about people, especially in informal language. For example, this is the girl that has eaten all the biscuits. That and who have the same uses. That and which. The relative pronouns that and which refer to things, to objects. That is more usual than which, especially in conversation. Example, the car that won the race looked very futuristic. Which is more formal. For example, all cells contain DNA, which holds genetic information. So you can see now the difference between that and which. It's just in formal and non-formal or informal conversation, but they have the same uses. We use them for objects and things. But that can be used also to refer to people. The relative pronoun whose. Whose refers to things belonging to people. It is used to express possession and relationship. Example, that was the man whose car was stolen. So here we have an example of possession. It's the man's car, okay? The possession. So it was stolen. That's why we are using here whose, to show possession. Relative adverbs. We can also use some relative adverbs at the beginning of a relative clause. Example, where. It refers to a place. We went to a camp where we stayed 2 years ago. So this is a place, it refers to a place. When, again, refers to a time. Example, I will never forget the day when I met you. So now we're going to move and understand more what is a clause. Define what is a clause. In its simplest form, a clause in grammar is a part of a sentence that usually consists of a subject and verb. It is usually connected to the other part of the sentence by a conjunction, by a linking word. It is not a complete sentence on its own. A clause can't be written alone because it will be incomplete. For example, John speaks. I work. So this is what do we mean by clause. And as we saw in the beginning, relative clauses are introduced by relative pronoun. Now we have already remembered together relative pronouns that we have already seen together. And now we are defining a clause, as you can see in the definition. Now we're going to move, understand the difference between defining and non-defining clause. Let's have a look at these two sentences. Can you see any difference between the two? Number one, my sister, who lives in Casablanca, visited me last weekend. This is sentence number one. Sentence number two, my sister, comma, who lives in Casablanca, comma, visited me last weekend. Of course, the first difference you can see here is the punctuation, the comma, in sentence number two. And in number one, there is no comma. Let's see why. Sentence number one, my sister, who lives in Casablanca, visited me last weekend. This sentence means that I have more than one sister, and I am referring to the one who lives in Casablanca. I am talking about the one who lives in Casablanca, who visited me last weekend. This is what we call a relative clause. It is introduced by a relative pronoun who, because here we are talking about people. And this is what we call a defining clause. It is definite. Defining relative clause. We also call it restrictive clause. This is another name. So it identifies the subject, which is my sister. I am providing direct information about which sister I am talking about. So of course, this shows that I have more than one, and I am talking about the one who lives in Casablanca. This is what we call defining clause. Number two, or before we move to sentence number two, let's understand what is defining relative clause. They give essential information about a noun or a noun phrase. We don't use commas in them, as you saw in the example. There is no comma, and we can't omit anything. We can't omit the relative clause because it's very important. It gives me essential information. For example, this is another example. The woman who lives next door is a doctor. I can't omit the relative clause in here. Now, for the non-defining clause, it's different. Let's have a look. My sister, comma, who lives in Casablanca, comma, visited me last weekend. In the second sentence, the meaning is different. It shows that I have only one single sister, one sister. In this sentence, I can omit this phrase, who lives in Casablanca. I can only say my sister visited me last weekend. All right, so this is an extra information. Who lives in Casablanca is extra information. I can omit it, and the meaning would remain the same. Unlike the first sentence that we saw together, because this is just an extra information. This is what we call a non-defining clause. So this is the difference between defining and non-defining. Non-defining relative clauses, they give extra information. This is number one. Number two, we use commas in them. You can also find that in the non-defining relative clause there is commas, and in the defining there is no comma. They are also called non-essential relative clauses, not important, extra information. I can omit this information and the meaning would remain the same. You cannot omit the pronoun in a non-defining relative clause. For example, John Lennon, who was born in 1940, was a member of the Beatles. All right? So I can omit who was born in 1940, and I can keep the sentence, John Lennon was a member of the Beatles, and the meaning would remain the same. Unlike the defining relative clause, you can't omit anything. The information is essential. Another example, my cousin, who is a police officer, lives in Fez. This is a non-defining clause. How? Because we have a comma and we have extra information. So this means that I have only one cousin and he is a police officer. Example number two. My cousin who works as a police officer lives in Fez. This is again defining clause. So I have more than one cousin and I am talking about the police officer. So you can see now the difference between defining and non-defining relative clause. Another example, the students who passed the test had a party. This means that all the students passed the test and they were all having party. However, if I say the students who passed the test had a party, this means that not all the students passed the test and only few had a party. So relative pronouns can be either the subject or the object of the relative clause. As we talked and saw in the beginning of this video, that relative clauses are introduced by relative pronouns. And relative pronouns can be either the subject or the object of these relative clauses. Examples: Marco Polo was a merchant who visited China in the 13th century. So here, the relative pronoun is the subject of the relative clause. Glaciers are rivers of ice which form in cold climates on mountains. So which here is the subject of my relative clause. Einstein is a scientist who I admire. So who here is the object of the relative clause, the object of scientist. This is a poem that I wrote in my first year. So again, that is the object of the previous clause in the sentence, of the relative clause. So you should keep in mind these differences between subject and object. So relative pronoun can be a subject or an object of the relative clause. Now let's combine the following sentences with a relative pronoun or relative adverb. It depends on the sentence, or it depends on the subject of the sentence and object of the sentence, of the relative clause. I don't like stories. They have unhappy ending. So here, of course, we're not talking about people. We're talking about non-people. So I'm going to use which or that. So how do we know? We have stories. So stories, non-people. So I would say, I don't like stories which have unhappy ending. Of course, I am going to omit the subject in the second sentence to avoid repetition. That's why we are using relative pronoun. So I am using one single sentence to join two sentences with the relative pronoun. Next sentence. Istanbul is a wonderful city. You can visit a lot of historical places there. So here I need a relative adverb of place, which is where. So the sentence will be the following. Istanbul is a wonderful city where you can visit a lot of historical places. Next example. The film is about a spy. His wife betrays him. So here I am going to omit his and replace it by whose to show position or relationship between the spy and his wife. So here we have relationship. The film is about a spy whose wife betrays him. I invited people to my birthday. They were late. So of course here I have people. I am talking about people. So I'm going to use who or that. Both are correct. I invited people to my birthday who were late. I omit again my subject to avoid that repetition. So here is a task for you. You are going to fill in the blanks here and complete this conversation with a suitable relative pronoun or relative adverb. So you have who, which, whose, or where. So please try to watch this video several times to make the difference and understand the difference between defining and non-defining relative clause, and also to refresh your mind about the relative pronouns uses that we have already studied together. All the best. And please don't forget to ask me any question in the comments. I'll answer right away. And I'm going to send you also another word, let's say file of relative clauses practice. Take a good care of yourself. Goodbye.